So thank you everyone for joining today. Welcome to the second event of Student Young Pugwash's Festival of Ethical Science. This is a month-long event we're hosting throughout November, where we're facilitating conversations all around this topic of ethical science. We had our first event last week, which focused on ethics and digital technology. And today we have Adina Pintilie from Ridgeway Information, who will be talking around the ethics of open source information or open source intelligence. So I'll give you a brief introduction to Adina. Adina is a researcher specializing in applying open sources to research tasks at Ridgeway Information, a research consultancy in London. Her work centers around finding new tools and refining novel research techniques, particularly supporting the International Atomic Energy Agency. Her open source work supports the European Asylum Support Office, the National Police Chiefs Council, the UK Civil Service, and a number of private sector clients. She is currently an Innovation Fellow in this year's N² cohort and a Girl Security Mentor. Adina is Ridgeway's focal point for the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy Network and leads Ridgeway's work on diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability. Previously, Adina worked in the European Commission's polling services in Brussels and supported ESRC projects and social politics. She holds an MA in Applied Security and Strategy, where her thesis focused on strategies used by disparate groups at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. So thank you, Adina, for agreeing to appear today and talk these issues through with us. Do you want to get started?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Niamh, and thank you to all of you for having me and joining us this evening. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. Okay, I think we should be good. So as Niamh was kind of mentioning, I propose that we talk a little bit about ethics and open source intelligence and how that kind of plays into the nuclear realm. I'd like this to be, as much as we can do, a conversation, because ethics are, I guess, a really subjective topic for all of us. And what I'd like for us today to do is first kind of have a brief understanding of what open source information is and how do we go from open source information to open source intelligence. Then maybe we can tackle the reasons why ethics are so important in this kind of research. And finally, I'm hoping to be able to bring all of this together and pose some questions to you, and maybe we can have a conversation about some of the choices that have been made around ethics and open source in the past. So first things first, what's open source information and how do we get to intelligence? The fellow you see here is William Donovan. He became good friends with FDR. He had an illustrious career as a lawyer, then kind of went into legislature and then finally ended up on Wall Street. And so in 1941, FDR made him coordinator of information. So some time passes, and after Pearl Harbor, the need for intelligence was clear, and Donovan's department was renamed the Office of Strategic Services. And that actually was the precursor to the CIA. Like the Special Operations Executive in the UK, the OSS was involved in everything from assassination attempts to agent running and information warfare. But it also had an entire branch dedicated to open source intelligence. So really, this is not necessarily a very old discipline, but not necessarily a particularly new one. Actually, the OSS's research and analysis branch meticulously collected dozens of newspapers, journals, press clippings, radio broadcast reports from around the world, hunting for photos and articles that may give away crucial intelligence about the enemy. And we fast forward to the mid-2000s. Reflecting on what we could call a short history of open source intelligence, we could argue that modern day OSINT is a result of a convergence of technologies. Some say that it began around 2009, and that's around the time of the Iranian Green Movement, when three main things happened. So first, we have a critical mass of smartphones with 3G connections in the hands of disaffected citizens. Secondly, these citizens use a small number of apps to share a huge amount of content about political events inside of their country. And finally, this data was free and open for the rest of the world to access and analyze. And whilst all of this is open source information, to get to intelligence, we are hoping to apply analysis and some value judgment. So today, by open source intelligence, we mean intelligence that's drawn from publicly available material, including but not limited to the internet, traditional mass media. So that would be TV, radio, newspapers and magazines, specialized journals, think tank studies, photos, and some geospatial information. Here's a round visualization that kind of explains this history in a different way. So we've talked a little bit about the first generation and the second generation. And some say that the future of OSINT is very artificial. We're focusing on machine learning and automated reasoning. But really, in my opinion, data's not necessarily the new oil. It's more like the new glitter. It lures humans with its shininess. It's really easy to accumulate. And it's almost impossible to get rid of, whilst everyone insists on using it without thinking through the consequences. So we may very well see that with the automation of open source intelligence, we have a mismatch between what we are being promised and the capabilities of this technology. It might very well be that in a couple of years, we go through what can be referred to as an AI winter, where we lose interest in this kind of technology when it stops to deliver. So all in all, whilst OSINT has had a relatively recent and short history, it's worthwhile noting that the future doesn't necessarily always deliver what we're being promised. So why are ethics a really big deal in open source intelligence? And I'll touch on 3 points that I think have been around in some of the conversation in the open source community. First, sources. How did we get the information? And what are we doing to protect the source if the information that we have acquired is actually quite sensitive? And how far did we actually go to acquire this information? Mark Lowenthal, a prolific figure in the US intelligence community, has said that the main qualifiers to open source information are that it does not require any type of clandestine collection techniques to obtain it, and that it must be obtained through means that entirely meet the copyright and commercial requirements of the vendors where applicable. That's to say, for example, on Facebook, you're not supposed to be scraping that data, or you're not necessarily supposed to be creating false profiles in order to view private content, although you can do it. That's not open, although technically that is OSINT. A good example on source protection kind of came earlier this year. You may remember this story from the news when a plane came down over Iran. And this piece of news is actually a clipping from the BBC. And we'd heard that the Iranian media reported that Iran's elite Revolutionary Guard had taken a person who posted a video of the missile striking the plane into custody. Later on, kind of the same day, we found that an Iranian journalist based in London, who initially posted the footage, was insisting that the source was actually safe and that the Iranian authorities had arrested the wrong person. And this is a real reminder that the information that can be acquired through open sources and transferred through open sources has real life consequences and impact, especially when it comes through different information environments that are not necessarily just as open. Ethics is also a big deal in open source research because that kind of data can be really easily manipulated. How do we use this data? What kind of story do we end up telling with it? And is it malicious even though we don't intend to? My origins, my research is into extreme groups and extreme behavior. And I wanted to bring this example kind of back into your minds. You may remember this. What you're seeing here is a tweet from a Twitter account that appears to be operated by a white Texan man. This particular tweet received a whole load of media attention. It was broadcast and rebroadcasted. And this tweet in particular shares a photograph of the aftermath of the Westminster Bridge terrorist attack in London, which happened late March 2017. So what we're seeing here is a Muslim woman walk past a group of people and a person on the ground who has been injured in the terrorist attack. The text in itself has Islamophobic connotations, claiming that the woman is purposefully ignoring the injured person, as well as an overtly anti-Islamic hashtag. That's not actually what we know that happened. We know that the Muslim woman was going away to actually call the authorities. We know that in the aftermath of a lot of this information being shared, that she was subjected to a lot of cyberbullying. And the key takeaway from this example is that visual disinformation is not always wholly false and can involve elements that are based on the truth. So the photograph here is real, but its context has been manipulated and falsified, and it relies on the reader, well, I guess the viewer, not knowing what the woman was actually thinking in that moment. Later on, we actually found out that the account was operated by Russia's Internet Research Agency and was used to spread mis and disinformation, which changes that whole story completely. A more nuclear-focused example comes from this fantastic investigation, which you can find on foreign policy, which refers to a February 2015 revelation. The National Council of Resistance of Iran, which is the political front of the cult-like dissident group, revealed the location of what it claimed was an underground centrifuge facility in the suburbs of Tehran. And judging by that title, I just kind of want to put that out there, that covert facilities are not something to be joked about. But in this particular case, we're talking about manipulation of images. And I've just lifted some bits of Jeffrey Lewis's and his colleagues' investigation here. So the press release contained a number of details that were obviously fabricated, and there are a litany of those, but I think this one here is kind of best visually illustrating this point. So the doors in question here, where you can see the actual description, were kind of a really big deal. And with open source intelligence tools and techniques, we're able to reverse image search that particular kind of image. And we learned that there's no reason for such doors a uranium enrichment facility, which is actually not subject to massive radiation leaks. And almost immediately, others who were kind of had access to this kind of information and the tools were able to determine that the picture of the door released by NCRI was actually lifted from an Iranian commercial website. And I guess the whole conclusion of that investigation is that the site that had been found was actually a secret site producing identification cards that had been visited repeatedly by foreigners. This kind of stuff has happened in the past, and administrations have reacted very differently. This particular piece talks a lot about the US and North Korea, and it's really worthwhile reading and looking into to see some of the history of misinformation when it comes to nuclear reporting. And finally, frameworks make ethics and open source research a really big deal, because making good ethical decisions just takes practice. Ethical decision-making frameworks can build structure into practice, and over time, they help make ethics second nature for professionals. And frameworks provide a method for interrogating ethical dilemmas and deciding upon courses of action and explaining the decisions that you have made to your audiences and your stakeholders. But naturally, ethics in practice are not black and white, and a single action can provide a social good and risk ethical harm. And balancing the possible ethical consequences of their work is a dilemma for analysts working with OSINT, and has continued to be. So let's try and bring this all together, and maybe I could get your thoughts on some of these choices that have been made in the past. A fantastic piece of research that was put together after talking to so many people in the community by the Stanley Center for Peace and Security talks a lot about ethical decision-making in both geospatial and open source analysis. And the reality is that analysts working with geospatial and this kind of open source data have capabilities that really not long ago were just exclusive to states. So a community of open source analysts can these days craft intelligence products, break news, add evidence to reporting, give insights where governments cannot, and provide accurate information to publics on issues critical to peace and security. Obviously, this is a really big responsibility, and it gives these individuals in our community considerable power and relative autonomy to exert influence over public policy. I guess that fortunately, until now, the effects of this community have been a net positive, and the community does provide quality and timely information to journalists and decision makers and publics. The result is actually a more dynamic and more participatory, I guess, a better informed overall public conversation, but it doesn't come without trade-offs like most of these conversations. So I wanted to put a case study in front of you, which actually appears in this report. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of the background of this. Here we're talking about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster that happened in 2011. This was the strongest earthquake in Japan's history. Some have called it the worst disaster since Chernobyl. And after the shaking actually stopped, the tsunami raced towards the shore, and almost all of 18,000 people who died that day on Japan's northeast coast died due to the floods. So the destruction, whilst absolute in its nature, the quake in itself didn't damage the plant much, but the tsunami shut down the emergency cooling systems, which then started to melt down. Hydrogen gases inside of the buildings then exploded, spreading radiation into communities more than 25 miles away. And therein lies the ethical dilemma. 48 hours after the tsunami had crippled the nuclear plant, an analyst in the open source community acquired a satellite image of the reactors. And it was immediately clear to her that the damage to the reactors and potential for radiation exposure to local residents were far more severe than the Japanese government's 25-kilometer evacuation zone would imply. The analyst felt compelled to do something that could give populations affected by the disaster a better chance to protect themselves from radiation exposure. And she also believed that she might actually be the only one with this image. Really, the question is, should she have published the image or not, and why? Publishing could actually help get information to residents and provoke the government to better protect those at greatest risk. But publishing, on the other hand, might risk amplifying chaos and hindering first responders. Not publishing could preserve room for the government and first responders to act, though doing nothing could make her feel as if she was failing to meet an ethical obligation to help those in need. So the question is to you now, do you think the analyst should have published the imagery or not? I'd be curious to see your responses before we actually find what happened.
Just while we vote as well, I'd encourage anyone who has any questions to drop them into the question and answer box at the bottom. And we can either read out the question at the end, or you can come onto microphone and read your question yourself.
Absolutely. I think perhaps maybe if we give it another kind of half a minute or so, if you could vote, that would be great. And I guess just a reminder, as Niamh was saying, very happy to take some of your questions. If anyone would like to speak and explain your answer now, also, it would be really great to hear your views on this before we actually talk about what happened. I think if it's okay with everyone, maybe we should wrap up on the poll, and then maybe we could figure out what the results are. And if anyone would like to join in and let us know their thoughts on this, that would be great. If that's okay, Niamh, Andrew. Great. I'm not sure whether I have control to see what the actual results are. There we go. It's actually happened. It's interesting to see that, you know, it's quite a strong skew for a yes. And I was wondering if anyone wanted to detail their answer, whether they wanted to type that in or whether they wanted to join in, and let us know what they thought about this. I'm going to try and open the chat. If not, that's something that we can totally pick up later on. And in actual fact, the analyst had very few resources to guide her ethical decision making. And actually, she only had 4 hours to decide. Chris has joined to say that there's a strong public interest component to deciding to publish. And interestingly, that's something that this case study in more detail was picking up on. Who gets to decide what the threshold of the public interest is. And I'd really be interested if we could pick this up on later on, because I think this is one of the ethical dilemmas that we face. Is it the means? Is it the ends that we reach? And in this particular case, she opted not to publish the information. She instead disseminated it to contacts in several governmental and non-governmental organizations, and it was then acted upon. I tried to look for some follow-up on this particular case study, but I think this kind of just got assimilated into the response later on. But kind of just looking a little bit more on how we make these decisions, there's a strong case for looking for a code of ethics for practitioners and anyone using geospatial and OSINT data that could serve important functions for the community. This could give moral guidance to practitioners, enhancing public trust in our work, and deterring unethical behavior. And this is just one example. I'd recommend you have a look in the way that this kind of step-by-step framework is built. It's a series of questions that one should ask themselves when they come across what appears to be an ethical question. And it's interesting that that process in itself is so multi-layered, and it's, I guess, one of those things that becomes second nature with practice. So considering that in the open source community, we value speed, sometimes more than we value accuracy, and we think about the ethics of doing OSINT well, it's really interesting to see that practitioners in the nuclear OSINT community have come together and thought, actually, this is what we need. We need more education. We need a code of ethics that we've put together, that we've bought in. We need to be able to rely on our peers and not feel that we're competing because of the public interest and the different type of motivation that we should have for this kind of work. So I guess now from me to you, a bunch of existential questions. Do you think that ethics is actually part of this culture of openness that is an issue in non-proliferation? Or is it that we're actually doing that right and we've missed the mark on other parts? I found it interesting that in the UK, the Committee on Standard in Public Life asks those delivering public services to follow selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. And can and should we ask the same of open source information and those who turn it into open source intelligence? And finally, I I'd like to hear your thoughts on approaches we take to ethics. Is it in this particular case, seeing as I guess the stakes are pretty large? Is it an outcome versus means? Happy to take any and all questions on this and hear your thoughts. But if you have any other further thoughts after this, this is how you can reach me. This is my email and that's my Twitter handle. Thank you for your time.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Adina. It's like really interesting. And I think especially the questions at the end raised some great paths of thought that we should all be taking after your excellent presentation. I would encourage all the participants to add some questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we can answer them then. I think I might take advantage, if that's okay, of my position as host, just to ask first couple of questions. So I'm currently doing a PhD, so I'm within academia, and when you are doing research at a university, you have to go through a very formal ethics process. So normally filling in a very lengthy form, going kind of as specific as what questions will you be asking your interviewees. Do you think within the open source community, there is a need or even a desire for having that kind of formalized ethics process? Like, could there potentially be a body that offers some kind of certification wherein they audit or support ethical questions and investigations? And then my second question is kind of around this issue of identity, which I think your second question pulls up. So I think when people work in public services, they often have quite a strong identity as public servants, and that I think facilitates having these kind of responsibilities. So you have these responsibilities and they're tied to your identity as a public servant. Do you think within the open source community that is such a strong, is there that similar kind of either culture or identity that would kind of support those kind of same responsibilities? Or is it that the open source community is a bit too diverse to have kind of one straightforward expectation, like the ones you detail in the second question?
Great, thanks for that. I think on your first question on kind of seeking out advice from a more professionalized body and kind of sitting down and figuring a code of ethics and a way to do it, interestingly enough, from some of the conversations that I've participated in and some of the questions that I've been asked around ethics and this kind of focus group that was put together by the Stanley Foundation, actually the question was not whether we should have them. The question was what will work best and what will grow organically with the way that open source works. And the suggestion that participants in the group had come up with together was kind of borrowing from journalistic standards. The idea that information moves so quickly that we can't be bogged down in the way academia does things and filling in and waiting for approvals from committees. And it was a great kind of moment of relief, I think, to hear that everyone in different kind of setups doing open source research in the nuclear realm, whether they were from a huge think tank or a really small think tank, or whether they were working in doing open source nuclear for government, were just as concerned about some of the stuff that kind of slips through these ethical kind of, I guess, loopholes. And I think, I guess, in my opinion, that these kind of questions are the questions that every good researcher should ask themselves. How did I get here? What am I trying to get from this particular kind of research? But I think this kind of ties in itself with your second question about identities, because I think whilst in the open source community, the people who are working really hard to share their knowledge and make sure that a lot of these best practices are shared and followed, are very keen to follow ethical ways of doing this work and transparency and making sure they're fully auditable. And there are others who are very keen to just have the first reveal and the most retweeted thing that came out there and the revelation. So I think being an open source researcher in the nuclear realm is an interesting nexus because the responsibility is very different. And I think in general, in the nuclear community, in terms of research, whether it's open source or not, it will be great to see a shift that seems to be starting slowly towards value of the work that we do, not just having a goal post and, you know, being the first to publish some stuff, but actually thinking about the bigger outcomes of that and why it's such a big deal.
That was great, thank you. We have another question now from Emily. And Emily, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question. So bear with me a moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Niamh, and thanks for a fantastic presentation, Adina. It's so interesting to talk on all of the different ways that ethics impacts our practice and our thinking. My question is kind of a boring one for people who aren't ethics nerds, I guess. How practitioners who work collaboratively on their decisions and attempt to engage, ethical thinking in their practices, weigh up all the different philosophical approaches and individual approaches to personal ethics, particularly because there's no right answer as to which ethical framework constitutes the right one or the best one in this space.
A great question. Thank you so much for that. I guess I kind of thought about the big questions, and I didn't think to talk more about the practical side of things. It seems to be, especially in open source and geospatial information when it comes to nuclear research, that a lot of people are really interested in engaging with this kind of ethical thinking frameworks and doing, your typical red teaming exercises and what do we do and how do we do this, and doing a post-mortem of that. But also not just kind of what could we have done better for this piece of research, but how could we have thought about this differently? And I think that becomes a way to engage better with these frameworks when we bring different people in the field. It would be great to think of ethicists just as valuable as any other kinds of researchers in the non-proliferation field. So to me, it's bringing different voices who are going to question the way that you do things. But in practice, there is a really heartening movement in different types of open source that people do in different realms, as well as in nuclear, to engage with different types of frameworks and actually ask these questions in a structured way and kind of set aside time and think, okay, so we did this. This was an open source investigation. We did it. We delivered the product. What now? Could we have done this better? And the information that we got, whilst this was really useful, it served the ends. Were these the best means? Should we do that next time? Should we talk about it and disseminate it with other teams? Because otherwise, it's one of those, I guess, a boring ethicist point is that it just kind of becomes, we do it once and then we do it again, and then it just becomes a path dependency and it comes in our culture and we all do it because that's just how things are done here. So I guess because I'm a process nerd, I really enjoyed that question. But I think it's really encouraging to see that people who want to do open source well really care about the way it's done and the impact it has on the communities which it eventually serves.
That was a great question. So I'll just highlight in the chat as well. So someone has linked the Stanley Center Open Nuclear Network report on ozone ethics, and then also an article talking about the case study that Adina walked us through, if anyone would like more information on those. I'd love to ask a question just while I can, and I would encourage all participants to ask questions because I think we've got a great speaker here to pick the brain of. I thought it was really interesting kind of what you hinted at the end of what you were just saying about how open source can serve the community. And do you think it's kind of a set of skills and a set of ways of working that could be really useful in lots of different fields? Do you think there are kind of any ethical obligations or standards that might encourage analysts to think about how they could use what they do in their day job in potentially other areas?
I think the quickest way to answer that question is, strictly speaking, open source doesn't require you to create, fake profiles, sock puppets, and how to do Python to scrape gazillions of pages. So I think open source is a fantastic way of being applied to so much research. When it comes to giving you pause for thought, to me, kind of when I started doing this, and most of my research was about people and people with very extreme views, it was, how do I make sure, even though this information was readily available, and it was readily available with a purpose, it was supposed to be there, it was supposed to be very easy to reach, it was serving a message for that particular community. When I do report on this information, how do I make sure that it doesn't become very quickly defamation? And how do I make sure that the people who put that information out there are protected? And I really, really deeply wish that someone had taught me how to do that when I was at uni. Someone had sat me down and said, this ethics form is not just a big deal thing that you have to do because that's how we do things here. It actually matters whose data you use, and it actually could matter to someone's, livelihood. You put stuff out there in a bunch of academic papers, and even though we anonymize a lot of data, it can get traced back to people. So I think the pause for thought moment in applicability in just general research is, to me, kind of the second degree. What next? So you've done it, this is great, you've achieved your aim, and this has gotten you, the traction that you were after. So what now? And I mean, for honesty, the first time I, analyzed a lot of data, I kind of just got so excited that I had access to a lot of things. And this was before the Twitter API had been changed, and I had a lot of tweets from a lot of people. You could just get those really easily back then. And I just got so excited about everything that I could do that I didn't even actually stop to think too much. It was kind of like, oh, but these people are data points. But really they weren't, because I was just kind of doing something very different. So it was kind of just halfway through my analysis that I thought, oh my goodness, this actually has real impact. Let's kind of dial back. So I think the value of the open source community, the value that the open source community brings into a lot of realms of research is bringing different skills and different tools and different skill sets, but also because we live in very different environments where information can be so politically charged and so very easily weaponized, that the open source community, I think, should, and in some cases does, become hyper aware of the second degree.
Really good, thank you. We have a follow-up question from Emily. So she's asked, in engaging more voices and more views in these critical ethical discussions, there we go. How can we increase the diversity and inclusivity of the workforce to ensure new considerations are included?
This is probably, this is something that I'm really passionate about, and I've been working really hard to try and figure out what the right answer to this is. I think in terms of bringing voices into this field, as well as relating it to ethics, is actually allowing different voices in. Valuing people at all levels who are not necessarily trained in international relations, nuclear politics, big states. We've recently found that bringing an anthropologist into the team has been an incredible addition. Our anthropologist might not necessarily be trained when it comes to the nuclear fuel cycle, but that is a skill that we feel that we can impart on them. But hearing the way they process information is completely unlike everything that we do. So bringing different voices, there is so much to be said for different voices from different social backgrounds, from different cultural backgrounds, and at different points in their lives. But I think there's so much to be said for diversifying voices in the nuclear field, actually with kind of an eye to ethics and the way that we do things, in bringing people from a variety of disciplines. And I think that the nuclear field only stands to benefit from drawing people in rather than keeping people out. And it's really encouraging to see that, you know, some of the big players in research are really quite keen to start doing that. So hopefully, when we think about this in, I don't know how many years' time, we'll look back and we think, what did we do so good to get to this? But that's my hope.
Great, thank you. And again, would encourage any participants to ask questions, because having some wonderful discussions. And Jamie, we have a question from Jamie. Jamie, would you like me to unmute you so you can ask live, or are you happy for me to read the question out? Okay, so she said I can read it, so I will go ahead. So going back to Emily's first question regarding process, Jamie is curious as to how you might differentiate an ethical framework or approach to OSINT as compared to researching due diligence more broadly. So
from the work that I've done and the work that we do at Ridgeway, really we have different processes for this. From my experience, the due diligence and kind of research that way more broadly is, in the simplest terms, we are trying to find out this, and without even starting the research, this is how far we will go. On the kind of ethical approaches to OSINT in general and kind of starting a different type of investigation, from my experience and the things that we do, whilst we do set out to get to that point, and this is where we think we should stop, this is where the ethical decision making comes in play. Say we have come across some information that someone has posted, let's say on their Facebook profile, and this is just an OSINT investigation. We're trying to get a load of imagery around a particular thing. At that point, we kind of sit back and we go through the ethical decision-making framework. Should we use this person's imagery? Should we use this person's imagery considering what it represents? And then later on, should we actually maybe remove all of the personal identifiers? But if we remove those, could we trace back to that person? And if we still did that, what would the ethical implications be? And then I guess this is a case-by-case decision, which makes this even harder. I think for us, the due diligence and kind of research more broadly, I don't think expedite is a good word, but it's a more rigid process. And I have found it really hard making sure that every decision in a time pressured environment with different other constraints are actually a priority. It's really hard to, when you've been conditioned to do things really fast, to have the thought process of we need to stop and think, then report and act. But I'd be curious to see, you know, what you think, Jamie, about this, if other people have any other thoughts on this, because by no means am I an authority on this.
Thank you, Adina. I really liked your acknowledgement of how difficult these questions and conversations often are. I think having that be one of the first statements you make when grounding these kind of conversations, it sets a good tone, I think, for people to be willing to acknowledge how challenging this is and not assume that we have all the right answers from the beginning. Yeah, and if anyone as well would like to speak on any of the questions that Adina has proposed on the slide that you can still see, let us know in the chat and we can unmute you. We have another question from Emily as well. And I also have another question I'd like to add, if that's okay. So Emily's question is, can you recommend any good resources on the conceptual issues raised today? And then my question relates more to something I was thinking about when you mentioned about the Twitter API. Mm-hmm. And so obviously you used to be able to get a lot more from the Twitter API than you can now. And the restrictions they place on it is it is Twitter almost making a statement on what the limits of open source research is or perhaps should be. What kind of role do you see platform companies playing in the development of open source ethics? Because by platform companies, I mean essentially the companies that run these platforms, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, other kind of social media sites. The way that they design their websites or the ways that you can access their websites, they do influence the behaviors of analysts and maybe do suggest and influence ethics in the space.
Sure. On resources, what I found really useful is interacting with journalism ethics. I find that incredibly straightforward, and it might very well be because of my research and reading interest, but I find it really hard to get through like dense ethical texts. So I think what I will do is find the actual links and pass them on. But I have found kind of verification handbooks for journalists really useful, courses that are designed for journalists when it comes to looking and searching and doing ethical investigations online, really, really helpful. And we actually passed around some of those resources into our team. So I'll make sure to pass them on and so that everyone can enjoy them. And on the big platforms and gatekeepers, I think this is such an interesting question because some of my role is to interact with people from the law enforcement agencies who are trying to improve the way that they conduct digital media investigations. So before I started helping the team who does that, it was very much so in my case, how can I do my job better? And how can someone who wants to use this information for maybe malicious purposes can get this information? And that question to me was kind of just a binary, like there are good people and there are bad people trying to do this. And then obviously in the absolute moral good, the platforms have the responsibility to make sure that we don't abuse and all of this stuff. And that question became so much more nuanced to me when I realized that someone who might be a digital media investigator might need an awful lot of resource and time to be able to access someone's Facebook account if it's private, and there might not be anything there. So it might be that for them, the quicker way is to kind of have a sock puppet, and there's like loads of legislation on that end and how these things are being done ethically. But that kind of to me highlighted the fact that it's not always just like black and white, and maybe Facebook, it was really good that I could actually get through someone's Facebook profile without having to be their friend, because that was really useful for that investigation. But also this is super hard because someone may be using this information for completely different purposes that I'm not okay with when my Facebook profile is private. So I actually don't know what I think big tech should do. Every now and again, I go through kind of like how people go through AI winters and springs. I kind of go through moments of really trusting them, and then like another Senate hearing happens, and then you kind of just hear one of them just mumbling through something, and you think, really, you just hold all of my data that way? I think at the moment, I'm just really skeptical that any of the big platforms are effective gatekeepers. And I don't know who we're gatekeeping from. Other researchers, people who are using this data in the wrong ways in which we didn't agree, people repackaging our data. I don't know. I think I'm in a very skeptical phase of my research life.
Yeah, I really relate to that. I think especially I loved your observation about how adaptive users and researchers are when terms and conditions change or default privacy settings change. So we have about 8 minutes left if anyone wants to kind of jump in with any final thoughts or final questions for Adina. And we have a question now from Henrietta, actually. Henrietta, would you like to ask your question live, or I can read it out for you? I can read it, yeah. Henrietta observes that, very relatable actually, when Henrietta said it's very noisy where she is. I swear every time I meet like a massive lorry goes past my window. Will this be gone? Sorry, that was an aside. So Henrietta's question is relating to journalism. So she notes that journalists come under a lot of criticism for their ability to evade their industry codes of conduct. Do you have any thoughts about how to make sure open source investigative researchers follow the spirit as well as the letter of ethical guidelines? Should a sector-wide code of ethical practice be developed?
That is actually, I think, one of the points that came up in the group discussions that we'd had before with some of the folks at Stanley and like with some of the other teams that I've worked with. And the thoughts that kind of the things that I agreed with most is that when we're trying to put constraints on a community that essentially kind of can use the internet at will, is to ensure that you have buy-in. And I think it's perhaps the way for any community to ensure kind of new things and new codes and regulations being followed is making sure that everyone knows why they're happening and why we're doing this. Whilst I don't know if that can be done for all open source investigative research, because this kind of research has different types of uses, I think making open source investigations in the nuclear space responsive and actually responsible for following ethical guidelines should be easier because of the end of this whole exercise. We're not just doing an armchair kind of thinking moment of what could happen if. This has real life consequences. And of course, so much policy research and real research and like natural sciences has real life impact. But this seems quite a devastating impact if we get this wrong. So I think the way to make sure that open source investigations are compliant with ethical guidelines is to make sure that the communities, at least some of the people who are engaging in this kind of research in nuclear, is making sure that they have buy-in and they understand why these codes of ethics are important and why they should be followed. And I think for quite a lot of the people who do some of this research and they do it well, it doesn't seem to be a, we need to fight over this. It seems okay, this is logical. We should probably sit down and figure this out. And I think whilst we can all disagree and fight over budgets and I guess funding from different funders and organizations, this is one that probably we should all be able to agree with, given the platform to have this particular conversation.
Great, thank you. We probably have time for one more question if anyone would like to jump in. Or just give people a few moments to digest and think if they have anything. Bless you.
Thank you.
Oh, so Richard Guthrie has raised his hand. So I'm going to allow Richard to talk, and I think he has a final question for you.
Great.
Hello, it's more of a comment than a question. I'm very pleased to see you talking about the Committee on Standards in Public Life Principles as chair of what was the British Pugwash Trust, now the Joseph Rock Black Memorial Trust, who underpins a lot of the activities of SYP. Actually, as trustees, we sign a copy of the Nolan Principles as the principles from the Committee on Standards in Public Life as a benchmark to measure behaviour as, and I think it's a very useful benchmark to have, and I recommend anybody who's trying to look at the challenges of how to operate in an ethical and effective manner, that it's a good benchmark to look for. So often you can find them just listed as the Nolan Principles rather than from the Committee of Standards in Public Life, because Nolan was the first chair who then put those principles together.
That's really useful. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Thanks, Richard. I might steal the last question then, if I can. I'm curious to your question to the last question on the slide, to your answer to the last question on the slide there. So what approach do we take to ethics, outcome versus means? How would you answer that if you were to reduce it to a binary?
I have a master's in security and strategy, and they've taught me that when it's a binary, the answer is it depends. But I actually have come to believe from kind of different research teams that it actually, good research means nothing if you haven't done it well. And the more teams I join doing different things and kind of going away from nuclear and then coming back to nuclear, the importance of that cannot be stressed enough. If it's not research done well by, you know, different people with different views, with kind of competing things, making sure that, you know, there is some conflict and there's the dynamic, then it's not going to stand up. It's not going to stand up the test of kind of people poking holes at your argument. And I think it's really, really hard to defend a good piece of research if you're the one single person who believes in it. And when it's done well, there's probably a bunch of people who've made sure that that was done well. And sometimes, you know, I'm sure everyone has experienced this. There's a really good group of people and you're working really hard, and then you come up with something that just kind of feels a little bit flat. You feel like you've fallen short the process of, like, this was so great. We all sat down and we had such good conversations. But then, I guess in a very poetic way, we all carry on that process later on, and then we make that next piece of research better. So bottom line, for me, it's more important that the means of conducting this are ethical.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Adina, for speaking to us all today. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you as well for all your excellent questions and comments. I can see that we've just put in the chat pointing out that our next webinar is next week. So we have 2 more of our own events remaining as part of the festival. One, we'll be looking at lethal autonomous weapon systems next week. And then towards the end of the month, we'll be having a session on decolonizing science. So we've also included in the chat there a link to a webpage about our event next week. It would be great if you could all come along. And thank you again, Adina, for your time and for facilitating such an interesting conversation and giving such a great talk.
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you everyone for joining this evening.
Thanks. Have a great evening, everyone.
Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe.